Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life by Design podcast. On this week's episode, I talk with men's coach, Conor Beaton. Conor is the founder of Man Talks and is a leading men's work facilitator, international speaker, teacher, coach, and podcast host. In this week's episode, expect to learn the importance of having an initiation, not using shame to create change, why men should be coached differently to women, the importance of the direct felt experience, the importance of a men's group, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Now, guys, before we start this week's episode of the podcast, I want to talk to you about the Life by Design Mastermind. The Life by Design Mastermind is the mastermind for go-getters and high achievers who are looking to create a more successful, fulfilling, and balanced life by design. If you're serious about transforming your life, achieving your goals, and living a life on your terms, then the Life by Design is your golden ticket. Head over to the show notes and click on the link for more details about the program. Conor Beaton, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mate, I love your work, and I haven't actually told you this. We might go into it today, but I have done your shadow work course and loved it as well. So been a big fan of your work for quite some time and looking forward to talking all things men's work. Before we get started, can you give the guys a 60, 90-second spiel of who you are and what's got you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I run a company called Man Talks. We basically do, some people call it psychological warrior training. It's basically a mental health company for men who are looking to better themselves in their mind, their body, their relationships. And I focus predominantly on shadow work and attachment. Those seems to be like the two areas that I really play in. But we have courses, we have community, we have programs, retreats that all focus on the wellness and the betterment of men. And what got me there, the short version of is like I bottomed out in my life and basically just sort of like cratered everything that I had going on with some pretty bad habits and addictive behaviors. And when I started to come out of that, found a mentor that sort of put me on this path, who was very well versed in Jungian psychology and got me started in that vein. And so that's the short version.
Very short and succinct. What did that bottom out look like for you?
It looked like lying, infidelities, cheating on the woman that I was with, drinking too much, smoking too much weed, not really having a direction in my life. I was living in this sort of like normal existence that a lot of men find themselves in, which is on the outside, things look good, but behind the scenes, shit was a mess. You know, it's like, I kind of chuckle because my car comes to mind right now. I have a 3-year-old. And so every week I go and I wash the car, but the inside of the car is just a fucking disaster. You know, where I'm like, there's just Cheerios and like the back of my seat's all messy from getting him like, you know, from him kicking it and stuff like that. But that was kind of my life. You know, I was traveling the world. I had a decent career. I had a great relationship with this wonderful woman. And behind the scenes, I was really struggling. I was drinking too much. I was smoking too much. I was really addicted to porn. I struggled with not watching porn. And I just really didn't like who I was. At the core of it, I didn't really like who I was. And so the rock bottom came when the woman that I was dating found out about the infidelities that I had had. And instead of me sort of talking about it and opening it up with the people that were in my life, I ended up avoiding all of that entirely and just like moving my shit into storage and moving into the back of my car. And that was the rock bottom. I lived out of the back of my car for like 16 days. And I wrote about all of this in my book because I think it's, you know, while it's a pretty dramatic bottom out, and maybe that's not the bottoming out that most men have, I think that there's parts of it that so many men go through because we've kind of stripped mined initiation out of our culture. And so I never got any kind of a proper initiation into being a man, into manhood, into, you know, how a man should operate. I didn't have male relationships where I could talk about some of the hard shit going on behind the scenes. And so when everything kind of fell apart, it was this long, slow, steady decline. You know, it wasn't like I didn't see it coming. I knew that shit was going to fall apart. I knew that something bad was going to happen. I knew all of these, like I knew all of that, and I just didn't really know how to stop the train wreck. But I thought that I had to deal with all of that on my own. And when I came out of it and I started opening up to men in my life, I realized that that was the case for so many guys. So many guys were in the exact same position where on the surface, it looked like parts of their life were really doing well, but they were actually struggling. So, yeah, that's a little bit more in detail about what it looked like.
The long, slow, steady decline, I think a lot of blokes can relate to, consciously or unconsciously. Do you remember the stories that you told yourself at the time, whether it was justifications, whether you would find a way out of this, but you weren't like having been there? I kind of know exactly what you're talking about. I call it the like slow, subtle slumber that you find yourself in that just deteriorates over time. What do you remember the like inner dialogue for yourself of how you were thinking at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of self-hatred and lacking impulse control. I really had a negative perception of myself. And so I think that's very common for guys that are sabotaging quite a bit, is that there's a negative perception of themselves, something that they don't want to admit or come into contact with. And and for me, it was a result of I was in a lot of pain emotionally and psychologically. I really was hurting from stuff that had happened early on in my life that I had never really dealt with. I'd never sought help for, divorce, abuse, abandonment, things that I kind of felt like I just had to soldier on through. And so, but in that slow and steady decline, it really was a matter of self-deprecation, self-loathing. It was a lot of self-abusive talk, which I found a lot of guys carry. A lot of men speak to themselves in a way that they would never speak to another man, or they would never speak to a loved one, but they talk to themselves like that. And so that was a big piece of it. And I think the other piece that I'll put in is about self-sabotage, which is there's a very large misconception about self-sabotage that I've come to sort of discover in the work that I've done, which is we think that we sabotage to be out of control. It's like I sabotage to feel out of control. When I sabotage myself, I feel out of control. I have no impulse control. I can't stop myself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When in actuality, we are sabotaging to feel a sense of being in control. Because if you think about what you do when you sabotage, they're very known behaviors. They're usually patterns that you have played over and over and over again, whether it's womanizing or infidelity or drugs or alcohol or going to bed late and watching porn or waking up late and hitting snooze a dozen times. When we sabotage, we're enacting some type of unconscious control that makes us feel safe. That is in a very strange backwards way, giving us some sense of control over something in our life, usually because we feel very out of control in larger parts of our life, right? We feel out of control in a relationship or our health or whatever. And then we enact this sabotage and this self-destructive behavior to try and regain some semblance of control. So I just wanted to drop that in there because I didn't get why I was sabotaging for so fucking long. And it pissed me off. It was like, why do I keep doing this? Like, why do I keep going back to the same behavior? How come I can't stop myself? And there were many different layers to it, but part of it was the known behavior. It was this safe thing that helped me find some sense of feeling comfortable or normal or, okay amidst the chaos of my life.
You spoke briefly there about impulse control. Like, how did you overcome that? What was that process like for you?
Pretty brutal, honestly. A little painstaking. I didn't grow up in an environment where discipline was taught in a healthy way. Discipline was a punishment. It was not a practice. It was something where when I got something wrong, I was punished for doing those things wrong. And so I was deploying that same strategy in my adult life. Anytime I did something wrong, I would punish myself. I'd beat myself up for it. I'd shit on myself. I'd be harsh with myself. And that was never a recipe for developing impulse control. I think I wish that every man really got the truth that you cannot shame yourself into the positive change that you're looking for. You just can't do it. We try, but you can't shame yourself into the positive change that you're looking for. And so I had been trying to shame myself into impulse control for years, and it just didn't work. Beating myself up, berating myself, shitting on myself, it just did not get the results that I wanted. And so I had to start to positively reinforce when I did do something right, when I was able to say no to myself, set a boundary with myself. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to enact that behavior. And then I would do just a simple like replacement method. So for example, I struggled to quit porn. I've developed a whole program around it to help men because it was really something that I struggled with for a long time. And so every time that I would want to go and watch porn, I had this routine where I would stop myself from doing it, set a timer on my phone, sit down, close my eyes, take a few breaths, meditate, and ask myself, what am I actually feeling right now that I don't want to feel? Like, what's actually happening inside of me? Because for what I started to realize was a lot of these impulse behaviors were helping me to not feel something internally, right? Or they were helping me to feel better when I was feeling something negative, right? So if I felt anxious or angry or lonely or bored, there was a quick fix for that. And usually it was porn. So I had to implement a different behavior, which was every time I wanted to watch porn, instead of doing that, I set a timer, I did meditation, I did some breath work, and maybe I journaled about like what's actually going on inside of me. And oftentimes that feeling and that experience would then subside within a brief amount of time. And sometimes it wouldn't, and I'd have to, go do some other stuff. But that's part of what I had to do to develop impulse control. The other part of it, which I'll just say briefly, is I had to start to use the carrot instead of the stick, for lack of a better term. So I actually had to start to use positive reinforcement and really validate and appreciate and have gratitude for the efforts that I was making. And that really helped with the impulse control, because part of what feeds a lack of impulse control is that we're trying to escape some behavior or something that we don't like about ourselves. And that's usually a reinforcing mechanism, right? We lack the impulse control, we shame ourselves. And then because we shamed ourselves, we need the coping mechanism to help us feel better. And then we lack the impulse control. And then we just go round and round and round in a circle. So we had to break that cycle. I had to break that cycle by using some positive self-validation, some gratitude, some appreciation. And there was daily practices that I had, but I really made it a way of living and a way of being.
Have you noticed any common traits between those that have impulse control and those that don't, whether it's trauma related, whether it's, like anything in your work with men, between those that seem to have a healthy relationship with impulse control and those that don't?
Yeah. So trauma can sometimes be a part of it, right? Acute trauma like sexual abuse or physical abuse, mental, verbal abuse, but it can also be from more insidious things, more sort of subtle things like neglect, just not having a parent there to soothe you as a child, not having somebody there to support you when you're going through some hard times as a kid or understand what you're going through as a kid. That in itself can cause a good amount of nervous system disruption to a degree where you start to look for external objects, behaviors, and substances in your youth that help you cope with what you're feeling in your body. And that's a very, very common thing. And so for a lot of men, it's just like, oh, no one taught me what to do with big emotions. So every time I was angry or every time I felt anxious or alone, I just turned to whatever it was, right? Video games, porn, weed, etc. And that helped me feel better. The other thing is attachment. So this is a little bit more, I don't want to say it, like this is a little bit more like psychological education. But when we don't have secure attachment growing up, instead of being able to connect to a parent or a caregiver when we're going through something as a kid, what we will attach to is a substance, an object, or a behavior. And so instead of relying on relationships when we're having a tough time, we rely on some external substance or behavior to help us basically self soothe. And so, what a lot of men are lacking in their lives are substance oriented relationships, depth oriented relationships, where when they're having a hard time, they can reach out to somebody and say, hey, I'm struggling. I'm not doing okay, or this isn't going well and I'm not too sure what exactly to do about it. And so we rely less on relationships and over index on these coping mechanisms and behaviors. So those are some of the things that those are the two main things that I see happening with men.
When it comes to the importance of men's work, why is it important and what does men's work even look like?
Well, I think it's important because when you look at the therapeutic industry over the last 20 years, what you'll notice is a significant and substantial decline in male therapists, psychologists, counselors, to the point where we now have something like 75 to 80% female therapists in the industry. A lot of the ways in which a therapist or a psychologist will generally work with clients is very female focused and centric and oriented. So it's very much about identifying what you're feeling and then empathizing that you're feeling that way versus helping you actually develop strategies or behaviors that will essentially help you be more competent. A lot of men are going into therapy because they're struggling with something that they don't feel competent in or that they don't know how to deal with. And if they're just met with, oh, that's tough, or that must be so hard, that's only going to go so far. So I think there's a different way of working with men that I have found. And I've worked with some of the best therapists and psychologists in North America and sort of piece some of these things together. But for men, there is something useful in the pursuit of confronting the hard things psychologically. And we actually almost need that for our character development as men. Women, I would say less so. To a certain degree, they still need it, but it's not as important as it is for men. Like we actually fundamentally need and require almost like a like a nutrient or a vitamin, some type of confrontation with the hard shit in our lives. And so men's work is really about doing that. It's about helping you as a man to confront the hard elements of your life, the hard truths, the hard pain that you've experienced, the hard parts of your past that you haven't known how to deal with or make sense of, and to do that in relationship with other men. Because the hard part of what a lot of men experience is that they try and go through all this work alone, right? They maybe hire a therapist and they don't really talk to their buddies about it. And so they kind of go through their work in a silo. And men's work is really about brotherhood and camaraderie. My friend and mentor, Dewey Freeman, says that we're hurt in relationship and we have to heal in relationship. And I think as men, oftentimes we're wounded by other men. We felt abandoned by a father figure. Maybe we're abused by a man in our life. We couldn't trust a man. He wasn't there. He wasn't present. He wasn't attuned to what we were actually experiencing or dealing with. And that pain, that wounding lives within us. And so to have that grief or that anger or that pain in whatever capacity you want to put it, witnessed by other men and healed in tandem with other men is really transformational because there's just a different layer of I'm going to sit in a therapy room and do some of these things on my own versus I'm going to have these conversations with other men that are actually witnessing what I'm experiencing.
I just want to double down on something you said then, which I think is super important. And I feel like you spoke about it on your podcast, maybe the difference between therapy, which has its place, and men's work. What might that look like in terms of how we would work with a man as opposed to how we would work with a female? Just to kind of double down on the difference.
I mean, I think a lot of it is some of it's terminology, some of it's approach. Like we as men have been conditioned to over index our rational mind. So a lot of men live in their head, where a lot of women still live body oriented. They're very emotion oriented. They're very feeling oriented. And so it's a different tactic, right? If you're working with a woman, you can ask a woman, when you're talking about that, how do you feel? And she'll list off like, oh, I felt this and I felt that, and this happened in my body, and I was feeling this and I thought that. You ask that to a guy, you say, hey, when we were talking about that, how did you feel? He's like, I have no idea. I don't know. Because I was just thinking about what I was saying. And so part of working with men that's very different is actually about broadening their awareness into what I call their DFE, their direct felt experience. What's actually happening in your body? What are you actually experiencing? Did you notice a temperature change? What happened to your breath pattern? What happened to your heartbeat? Were you able to notice tension starting to happen in your body or weight starting to build on your chest? And guiding that man in a way where he can expand his awareness to understand what's happening inside of him, in his gut, in his heart, in his emotional body, etc. And so, just as a side note, I'm actually, because I feel very passionate about this, because I have a lot of therapists that follow me, a lot of female therapists and male therapists that follow me. I'm launching next month a training program for coaches and therapists who work with men who want to actually help men get results faster. Because what I've seen is that a lot of therapists, men can go into that environment and just talk and stay in their head for months and sometimes years and never get out of the story and never get out of what they think about. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is most men have some intensity in them that is frightening for some therapists. And what I mean by that is that when a man feels something, he can feel it very intensely. If you have a man who all of a sudden in a therapeutic environment is starting to feel rage towards his father, and you are a young practitioner, male or female, but especially female, right? If you have somebody that's like 6'1" and 230 pounds in your office, and he's starting to get really fucking mad about what happened with his father, and you're a 5'5", 120-pound woman, that's going to naturally set off the alarms in your body. It just is. And if you're not used to dealing with that type of intense energy, you as a practitioner might unconsciously interrupt that man's process. And I've seen that so many times where a therapist, male or female, will interrupt the intensity of emotion that's starting to come up within a man, whether it's the intensity of his grief or his anger or his sadness or his loneliness or whatever it is. And so I think that there's in men's work, part of what I always tell men when I work with them is nothing that you have to talk about or feel or deal with is going to be too much for me to handle. And we do that at the beginning of every retreat. We reinforce that at the beginning of every group that I run. I reinforce that because for the majority of men, they've been carrying some intensity inside of them that they're like, this is too much for somebody to handle. No, nobody can get this. Nobody's going to be able to handle this. Nobody's going to be able to help me through this. And so it's almost like, guys can like, really settle into like, somebody's got me. Somebody gets that there's some intense shit that I've been through, that I've experienced, that I'm feeling, that I'm dealing with right now in my life. And they're going to be able to help me navigate through that. And I think that the therapeutic industry at large, and I know it probably sounds like I'm shitting on it a little bit, and in some ways I am, but in some ways I'm just, calling out what's there. I think the therapeutic industry in some ways has tried to water down men's experiences to be more feminine and have treated men in that way. And it's done a disservice to men. And so a lot of guys, come work with me or they come out to a weekend or they join a group that I'm running. And within the first session or two, or the first hour or two, they're like, holy crap, like this is a totally different experience than what I've gotten in 4 or 5 years of therapy because their intensity did not have a place in the conversation. And so we have to make room for men's intensity. And I think that that's a big differentiating factor.
When it comes to men's intensity, not everyone can hold it, as you kind of spoke to there. What work have you had to do for yourself to be able to hold men in their intensity?
This is, I'll just try and give it to you as straightforward as possible. There's two pieces. Number one is facing and confronting my own intensity and understanding it in a really deep way, because I do have a lot of intensity in me. I do have sometimes a very intense personality, anger, right? I can have a very intense drive and determination that comes out. Like my wife and I joke that we have this running joke that we're two stubborn hearts. That's what we call each other, right? Because we're both incredibly stubborn in our own ways, but different. So that's one part. I've had to really come face to face with my own intensity and do my own work with very, gifted and exceptional practitioners. And then outside of that, I've had to work really hard to tune into my own nervous system and be able to regulate it when things are coming up inside of me. Because really good practitioners, really good therapists or coaches or counselors, what they're doing is while you're going through some hard shit, right? You're processing some childhood trauma, or you're talking about a betrayal. Maybe your wife or your girlfriend cheated on you and you've just discovered it. While you're going through this hard time and your nervous system is riled up and you're bawling or you're feeling a ton of anger and rage, they are sharing their nervous system with you by staying grounded and calm. And in that way, we're mirroring what should have happened in childhood when we were going through a temper tantrum or we were overtired or whatever it is. So we're actually creating an environment where you, as the person going through the hard shit, can feel what you need to feel. And me, as the clinician and practitioner, can stay rooted and grounded so that you feel safe to feel whatever it is that you need to, or express whatever it is that you need to. So that's the second part is this daily regular practice of regulating my nervous system, grounding under stress and duress, really practicing this modality of being grounded and rooted and knowing how to get back to that place quickly when I get away from it. So that's the second part of it.
You made the point that I was kind of looking for, which I think for some people is underestimated, is the importance of doing the work yourself. Like you can have all the certificates and qualifications, but if you haven't experienced your own darkness, your own psyche, your own intensity, you'll find it very hard to hold people in theirs. And you might even, I don't know if you've experienced this, I definitely have people that say that they can hold me. And it's all well and good to hear the words, but you can feel the energy when it shifts, when you go into a dark place or that intensity, and you can just tell energetically that they can't hold. So the importance, I guess, probably if you can just reiterate the importance of, whether it's a partner, coach, healer, therapist, of them exploring the depths of their psyche, of their intensity in order to hold you in yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key. I think there's a lot of what's the term? Wounded healers out there, right? And I mean, Instagram and TikTok and social media have distributed a lot of information about psychology and psychological well-being, but it's also given a lot of really messed up people terminology that they leverage as weapons against other people. I mean, the amount of videos that are out there about how many men are narcissists. I mean, you'd think that every single man on the planet is a fucking narcissist, right? Like it's insane. And or what's the new trend? Like manifestation, just manifestation coaching. It's not to knock any of that stuff. It's not to say that there isn't potency in those types of things, but a lot of times it's not rooted in anything of substance. And it's people who are very insecure, and it's people who have not done their own work, and it's people who are wildly out of alignment in their own lives. I mean, let me put it to you this way. If you followed me around for a day or two or a week, what you would discover is I am the same person, whether I'm talking with you or my wife or my friends or doing an Instagram live or interacting with my son. And that doesn't change. I'm the same person everywhere that I go. And I live the values that I talk about. I live the values that I talk about. I get up, I do the breath work, I do the meditation, I do those pieces because I know there's a real consequence for me not doing those things. My relationship will suffer. My ability to be a father will suffer. My ability to be a good friend will suffer. My ability to run my business will suffer. All those things will move in decline. And so, it's very important for you to to also take that into consideration when you're looking for a coach or a therapist. Like, don't hesitate to ask them, what are you working on personally? I've had clients ask me that, and I'm very upfront with them. I'm like, here's what I'm working on. The recent thing, my mom passed away 5 weeks ago. So, like, I'm working on staying close to the grief of losing a parent for the first time. And that's a very nuanced, new, and challenging thing. So, I think that that's a very important part of the equation, because otherwise, what you have is projections and people giving advice to clients and people giving advice to the people that they're working with that is rooted in their own pain and their own wounding, and that does not serve or help anybody, just creates a mess. So there's my rant.
I love it. Well, one of the things you spoke of just briefly there, and I've been a big fan of sharing my own experience to normalize and neutralize someone else's experience. It's really interesting when I talk to the more kind of traditional psychologists and psychotherapists who don't share any of their experience. And I think they kind of learn that through their learnings. What's your belief of clientele understanding you on both a personal and professional level, as opposed to the more traditional approach where they just understand the professional side of you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say about the therapeutic and psychological industry, but I think there can be a time and place for you, specifically as a psychoanalyst, as a psychotherapist, as a psychologist, to be a space of listening and witnessing for the client that is not interrupted by your personal story or experiences. There can be benefit in that. However, I would say that that is largely relegated, in my opinion, to diagnoses, to you operating as a practitioner who is looking to diagnose some mental health disorder. Whereas where I come from is that there's been a lot of research done that has shown that the most important element to a therapeutic dynamic between a client and a practitioner, whether it's a coach, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a psychologist, is actually the rapport and the relationship between those two people, between client and practitioner. And so, is it really relational if you don't know shit about that person's life at all or them at all? Not really. That's not a reciprocal relationship. And that can hold people sometimes in a wounding pattern where they operate from anxiety or avoidance of talking about things that they need to talk about, because the other person is just this blank slate that they can never get anything out of, and they don't know anything about them. So there's merit in having things be relational. And where I often operate from is, you know, a really good practitioner is oftentimes helping you to repair some form of interruption to your attachment or your ability to do relationships in a healthy, meaningful, grounded way. That is unequivocally one of the most helpful things that we can do. And I think in the future, what we're going to find with the rise of AI and AI therapy bots that are going to be coming, and the fact that you're going to be able to access, an AI therapist, what you're going to find is that that AI therapist is going to be extremely proficient at developing a relationship with you. And the problem is that it's going to miss out on who that quote unquote person is, because there won't be a person on the other side. And so it'll kind of be one dimensional and one directional. It'll be all about you. And that's very feeding for your ego, but it's not very feeding for what Carl Jung would have called the self, right? The innate part of you that is literally architected to be in relationship with others. We are built physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, on every plane of our existence. We are built to be relational. And so for me, I think that any type of therapeutic, coaching, psychological endeavor that doesn't have some type of relational component embedded into it is going to be missing something.
I'm glad we agree on that one. I still don't understand it. When it comes to structuring a good men's group and the, I guess, formalities of that, you obviously run them, but you're also part of one with a few guys that we've had on this podcast before, with Mike Campbell, Mark Rose, Trevor Bum, and I feel like I remember, I think it was you were talking about it on a podcast at some stage. What's the structure of that group for you guys? Is it that you catch up weekly? Like what's fortnightly? What's the actual structure for you guys in your own men's group?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways you can go about this. I actually next week, so I don't know what day that is, but it's like Thursday the 11th. I have a deep dive podcast on actually how to start your own men's group. So that'll be coming out for those that are really interested in that. But the basic version of it is a couple of things are really important. Number one, you need to get clear on the who. So who are you inviting into this? You probably want men that are committed to growth and development. It's very important. You probably want men that are willing to be transparent and talk about hard shit. And you probably want men that are willing to hear hard things from you. Those three elements are really important in terms of who you choose. Next, the group needs some type of purpose, mission, or intent. So you have to have some intention for the group, right? Are you a group that's oriented towards depth? Are you a group that's oriented towards spiritual development or sexual development? Are you a group that's oriented, like our group is oriented towards depth? That's what we're really interested in. So get clear on your purpose and your intention, because that will become the filter through which everything can get passed through, right? It's like, does this match our mission or our purpose or our intention for this group? No? Okay, we're not doing it. The last couple pieces that I think are important, have your what I call ROEs, your rules of engagement for the group, right? Be on time, be transparent, don't do other shit while you're on the call if you're virtual, like just that kind of stuff. Have your rules of engagement. And then I think some of the most important pieces, that probably the biggest piece where most guys get it wrong in men's groups, is they're either way too overstructured or they're way too understructured. So they either have this like rigid structure where everything's dialed in to like the minute, or like every 5 minute block is like dialed in. And for some guys, that's crazy making, or it's just what the rest of their life looks like. And so it's exhausting. And then on the other side of that equation is no structure whatsoever, which just turns into a group of guys shooting the shit, talking about politics and funny stories and gifts that they saw. And then you miss out on the depth of the conversation that you actually need. And so generally speaking, I open my men's groups all the time with a meditation or an exercise every time, no matter what, any group that I've ever run. Second is a check-in, and the check-in, you can adopt whatever you want, but usually it's like celebrate a win, celebrate a challenge, and where do you need support? Then there's a topic, and that can be a book that you're reading, a course that you're doing, something that you as a group have agreed to discuss. And then there's a hot seat. And that's where one or two men are going to have a set period of time to bring forth a challenge or a problem that they're dealing with, where all the men can support them with that challenge. And then you close out with some type of closing ritual, right? So it's not just like, cool, we did some deep work, peace out. You need some type of closing ritual to just yeah, close it out. So that's a basic structure that people can follow.
So when you think about the men that you're surrounded by and the depth that you can go to and the support that you have, what are some of the traits that the men in your life have, or for you as you're closing out the men's circle, your own men's circle? Is there accountability? Is there check-ins between calls? Like what are some of those traits and support look like for you with your men?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've fostered a culture of checking in with one another when somebody's brought forward something that is, tough or hard or challenging. We've also developed a culture where it's very clear that it's your responsibility to bring that hard shit forward. It's not my job as a man in the group to try and coax those things out of you, right? You have to pony up to the table. You have to show up. You have to say, "Hey, here's what I'm dealing with. Here's what's challenging." I can, I'm very attuned, obviously, because I've spent the last 10 years working exclusively with men. So I have a very good bullshit detector for guys. So, I will sort of poke and prod, and the other guys will poke and prod sometimes because they're in the space as well. But we have a culture of personal responsibility, self-leadership, that you bring forward what's going on. And then the check-ins in between, we don't do accountability partners in our personal group. I think it's helpful. In a lot of the groups that I run, I have accountability partners, but we don't do that because the 9 of us are the best, we're just best friends. And so we're constantly checking in with one another. It's Thursday. I've talked with 3 of the guys this week that are in my group already. So like FaceTime, phone calls, voice memos. And so I like having the accountability there is sort of not necessary. But for some men's groups, it's very, very important to have that accountability where you check in, once a week with your accountability partner and you go over, again, a check-in, what's happening in your life, what are you struggling with, et cetera. So those pieces can be very helpful, but fostering a culture of self-responsibility and active support are very important. What I usually tell men in the groups that I run is I usually get them to look up the definition of tend, T-E-N-D, and what it means to tend to someone, and then to embody tending to another man. What would that look like? And if you were to operate from that place, that's my expectation of how men show up in a men's group. That I'm not just going to hear you talk about how you and your wife are going through a divorce and then not talk to you until next week. I'm going to check in with you because I give a shit about you. And I'm going to make sure that you know that I give a shit about you. Like I'm a little relentless like that. And I will always advocate for that for guys that are in men's group is like, be relentless with ensuring that the other men know that you give a shit about them. Don't make them question it, and operate in the way that you know how so that they know that you care. And it will land. I promise you, it will land every single time. Don't be obnoxious about it. Don't force yourself on them. Don't be a stage 5 clinger, like none of that stuff. But be a little bit relentless. That might mean that you have to check in more than once. That might mean that you check in and they don't respond and you follow up. Like I did that the other day with a buddy of mine. I checked in with them and I could see that he read the message and he didn't respond. And then I sent him just like a ridiculous GIF and was like circling back on this with you. And, he immediately was like, oh man, thank you so much. Like I got lost in the weeds. So do that kind of stuff. It goes a long way.
When it comes to having the right kind of men around you, what does that look like? Because for some blokes, they might be like, oh, this is perfect. I can go down to the pub and watch the footy and have a few beers and talk shit. But what's the difference between the type of men that are going to really kind of support you and the average bloke that you can go down to the pub with?
Well, I think that those can be the same guy in some situations. I don't drink, but I can go to the pub and watch UFC with my buddies that are in my men's group. We can go to Muay Thai together or, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and talk about just normal guy stuff. But we can also have very deep, meaningful conversations about what's happening in our marriages or our relationships or becoming fathers or having lost a parent or, dealing with a health problem. Like we can have those conversations as well. And so I think that they can be the same guys. Sometimes they're separate, they're different men that you're going to the pub with and watching. I think you guys call it footy, watching footy with. Sometimes they're separate, but I think the men that I'm talking about are guys that are willing to engage in like radical transparency, that are willing to confront hard truths about their life, that are willing to not sugarcoat things for you and sometimes call you forward, not call you out because that's oftentimes very ego based, but call you forward into who you have said you want to be. That's the juice. That's where the real gift is in male relationship is like, who have you said you want to be as a man? And the more that I can understand that, the better that I can hold you to that. And I can call you into that. And I can say, hey, I remember you told me you want to stop drinking. And, last week, and now you're telling me that you went out and had 5 beers last night and, got half in the bag. Like, what's going on? You told me you want to be a man who's sober. So it's those types of things. And ultimately for me, it's men who are interested in orienting their life towards some type of depth, whether that's depth in brotherhood or connection or relationship or purpose or mission, but some type of depth in their life. I think that is an incredibly, incredibly important trait.
Mate, it's been so good to connect with you and really get insight into the men's work and the magic that you bring to men's work in particular. For those that want to find out more about you and the work that you do, where's the best spot to send them?
You can go to mantalks.com. All my stuff is there. You can check out the podcast. My YouTube channel is just Man Talks. We've got a ton of guys following there. And then on Instagram, it's at Man Talks. It's pretty much just Man Talks everywhere. So
Beautiful.
mantalks.com or Instagram or YouTube, and you can find me.
Conor Beaton, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.